Welcome everyone to Boston. We're going to call this a fireside chat because it's nice and warm in here today. It's actually warmer than Chicago at least. And excited to have a higher ed discussion. This is one of the main higher ed panels at the event, and joined by a series of experienced executives and innovators in higher education. And we want to have a dynamic discussion, so we're hoping to get you involved with your questions and comments as we go. So I'm joined here by George Moore, who is CTO at Cengage. Also Don Kilburn, CEO of UMass Online. We also have Nina Huntemann, Senior Director of Academics and Research from edX. And Renee Altier, who is VP of Product Strategy and Business Development at Wiley. And you do have their bios in the session guide, or rather the conference guide. So we're not going to use our time to talk about backgrounds. But I think we really just want to dive right in, and maybe we'll kick off by going down the line. And you know, my main question is just: are you optimistic or pessimistic about higher ed? There's some growth in some pockets. There's certainly colleges that are closing. There's change in the online market. There's a host of dynamics, but we're going to talk about. But I'd be interested for each of you, maybe in a minute or so, what are the key themes that come to mind, and is your outlook optimistic or pessimistic? So maybe we'll start with you, George.
Sure. So I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. I think learning is still needed. It's still, students still are looking to further themselves, but the landscape is changing dramatically, and we are seeing schools close. We're seeing the modality of how students are going into school changing, and I think the ecosystem of the traditional institutions is being stretched. And I think, you know, with a lot of what we're seeing a really surprising number of students who are personally dually enrolled in two schools at the same time. So students who are going to a traditional school, but going to a community college to take a few classes at a lower price. So that's not what the institutions are preparing for, and they're not planning for that, but it's happening. And so we're seeing those trends happen, that there's still a lot of education happening, but it's happening in a very different way. And online classes are, you know, the number of students who are in a traditional school on campus, but also taking two of their classes online. So those different trends, I don't think the ecosystem has caught up with it, but I think as we go through it, learning is still needed, and so the ecosystem will catch up. So I think higher education as a whole has an optimistic future, but there'll be a lot of change in the process.
Okay, Don.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that. Clearly education is going to be crucially important next 10, 20 years. You've got the rise of robotics and AI. You have a lot of displacement of jobs. You have employers looking for skilled workers, and you have a lot of people questioning the value of higher ed, but no one's questioning the value of increased learning around those dimensions. So, you know, I think the question is not, you know, should we be optimistic about higher? I think we should be optimistic about education in general. I think what we should really be concentrating on is what's that evolution look like, and how do we make what we call higher ed more efficient and effective for working populations in very changing environments across the world. So.
Thank you.
I'm enthusiastically optimistic. I think from the perspective of a learner, there's like no better time to be potentially engaging with post-secondary education. I think that institutions are going to be responding unevenly, as we've already seen. Some are prepared, some less so. Some haven't even taken their heads out of the sand. But from a student perspective or a lifelong learner perspective, I think it's a fantastic time to be engaging with post-secondary ed, because there's just so many different ways to do so. At different price points, for different purposes, and institutions that recognize that expanding market, they'll flourish.
Great, and yeah.
I'm also enthusiastically optimistic. So, I mean, I think it's nuanced, right? You've got very significant declines in the for-profit space, the traditional for-profit space. You have large increases in online education programs. You have kind of flat four-year. It is all about when the universities are coming in to innovate. I think the thing that we have to look at across industry and across higher education is, what does the profile of a student look like today 40% work 30 hours or more while going to school. 25% work full time. 25% are parents. So you're looking at institutions who I think are going to survive, are really thinking about the learner and what that means and what they need. And so different modalities, different approaches to education. Never before, I think when you talk to professors, when you talk to administrators, the schools that are going to survive are looking at the whole picture of the student. So they're looking at the education models, they're looking at curriculum, they're looking at mental health services, they're looking at resilience training. And what I find most exciting is that some universities, so like Dawn said, some universities are farther ahead of this than others, are actually innovating around those models. So actually really focusing on the learner and then building the models around it. And we in businesses that support education have to do the same thing.
Great. Well, we have a very diverse audience here in terms of the perspectives and organizations and sectors and segments that people come from. Universities, the investment space, companies, tech firms, and so on. You each either are at a publisher or services firm or have been at one or at a university, et cetera. If you thought about the sort of business audience and the startups and where the investment will be, where companies might make acquisitions, what do you see as the products, if you will, or the growth segments of higher ed? If you were serving higher ed, where do you think those pockets of growth are for services and products? Anyone want to kick us off there? Yeah.
I'm excited about the space and student support and all that could potentially mean and do. We've already seen several different takes on that, whether it's chatbots helping students persist into school, taking care of summer melt, or helping students get connected with services they need, whether at campus, whether actually physically at campus, or virtually getting support. And I'm really excited about how we scale those to be able to match all the different modalities of how students are engaging with learning. So again, it's going to be I imagine a tool set of digital, synchronous, asynchronous, in-person, virtual. So if I had money to invest, which I do not personally, that's one of the places where I'm really excited to see what happens.
Great.
Yeah, I agree. I think right now, if you put yourself in a student's shoes, this is more of a choose your own adventure story for them. They are figuring out the best way to get through their education. They're not being led the traditional way that many of us went through our college career. And I think with that, these services really do help augment that and help bring them through this process. I would say that the technology and being a technologist at heart is incredibly important, but the affordability angle here is exponentially important. And I think as startups and investors looking at how you can do this at scale at a cost that makes sense, I'm seeing a lot of solutions that are great, but it's hard to figure out who's going to pay for them. And that right now, the number one piece that both students and institutions are looking at is how do we lower the overall cost for higher education in the United States.
Don?
Yeah, just from a U.S. perspective, I think there's approximately $500 billion spent on higher ed in a typical year. Of that, if you begin to start segmenting that market, $4 to $8 billion, depending on how you want to define it, goes to course materials. I think there's real opportunity as you look at that $500 billion to spend to figure out ways that institutions might outsource pieces of that spend to either be more effective or more efficient. And I think one of the areas that people are looking at is, on that service area around education, as you see a migration from less analog or face-to-face to more online digital learning, what kind of services do we need to provide, whether it be student support or mentoring or financial aid services? I think that's an area that a lot of people are working at. I think a couple of other things. I think you have to figure out whether you want to be a direct provider to students or whether you want to be an enabler. Many of the current ed tech companies and publishers are, frankly, they're enablers of institutions and faculty to actually teach. They're not really direct teachers. So you got to think, if you're an enabler, you have to think about the business a certain way rather than, if you're directly related working with students. So I think that's something to also to think about as you're forming. And the final thing I would say is you probably need to think about, as you think about businesses, what segment are you are you actually addressing out there, and who's your customer? So if you say faculty is not faculty. I can tell you right now, faculty in a community college is quite different from someone in a place that is around workforce development, quite different from Ivy League. And the same is true for students. They have, whether you be a working adult who's 35 or an 18 to 22-year-old, those are very different customer segments, and you need to actually think about those deeply as you're thinking about where to go.
Renee?
So, heartily agree. I think in terms of investments, so you mentioned equity and access and student support, really helping students to succeed. So you've seen a huge uptick in institutions around how to leverage data and make it actionable. So obviously, from an institutional perspective, the biggest risk for your institutional health, besides bringing students on, is losing students, especially between the time they say they're coming and the time they don't show up, the summer melt, or between the first and second years, and obviously graduation. So you've seen a lot of companies emerging and succeeding with leveraging data across different points, right? Non-cognitive and cognitive or academic data, and then finding triggers. And I think we're not quite mature there yet, but that's really an evolving and interesting area. And for Wiley, that's something we're looking at as we also build out our OPM businesses. So
Great.
How do you help students stay?
Well, so on that point and connecting to, this is a key theme I wanted to maybe talk about a bit now, is enablement and service models. And in certain circumstances, we might have thought of it as outsourcing, but there's this value chain. Higher ed is still a very large market, and more is being done with outside enablers. Wiley has a significant business there. edX is moving into degrees. So maybe we could, if we want to stay with you for a moment, Renee, could you talk a little bit about how you see that enablement business? OPMs are very popular, and I know many are curious what's going to happen with that business model. How sustainable is it? There's any number of themes we could talk about there.
So there was a really interesting series of tweets. I don't know if people saw that this week.
Did see that. I think
the
it was Inside
OPM
Higher Ed.
tweets
Yep.
between
Josh
Titan, yes, and so I think I'm a big believer in a partnership between industry and institutions, and that institutions don't have the capacity, to deliver online programs solo. And so there's definitely a place in the market for OPMs. And you could say, well, we're gonna do this ourselves. That's great. There are models in all aspects of higher education, from OER to online programs, where an institution might try to do it themselves. But OPM businesses bring a level of expertise in marketing, in recruitment, in support, in learning design, in faculty enablement, that I think as long as they're partnering with the institution and they're adhering and embracing the institution's mission, I think there's a space for it. I mean, the other thing that institutions are really looking at is, so you look at decline in traditional enrollment, but where is it growing? It's growing online, right? I mean, not only a third of students last year took at least one online course. The number of students who never took an online course decreased from like 5.7% to 2%. It's a lot. There are a lot of learners who want to take online learning, just like Ryan Craig said in his keynote this morning. So I think there's certainly room for services as long as you're in partnership with the institution, or you're looking at what the learner needs and delivering modalities outside of the institution, like so many of the edXs, Coursera's, et cetera, who are also emerging.
Right, and so maybe we'll go to edX next for a moment.
Yeah, so one of the things I'd say about the OPM market is, at least at the universities that we've been working with, is that maybe you could say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they didn't have the capacities for a lot of the things that a traditional soup to nuts OPM would offer, but they've been building those capacities on campus. And so, 5 years on, 10 years on, they don't need the full suite. And so I think one of the things we're seeing, and this is edX's approach when we work with our partners to do degree programs, is to find out what capacities do they have on campus and what do they need to fill in. And how can an OPM service, hopefully if they are into suiting or slicing some of their services off, just do that kind of more strategic filling in the gap there. And of course, the other thing I'd say too is that the OPM contract that might have in the past been a decades-long contract, I think a lot of universities are hip to that's too long of a contract for us to be nimble enough to make change, perhaps. And so they're looking for potentially more flexible and shorter contracts to be able to adjust as the market changes.
And Don, you're at a university now as CEO of UMass Online, and you were at Pearson. Thoughts on all this?
I have a unique perspective on both sides of the fence, depending on where you come from. Some say I went to the dark side, others say I left the dark side. I'm not sure which it is. But, so OPMs have a couple of, they're the value proposition. One is they are a bank on the front end for institutions who do not want to actually do that kind of spend on the front end, and in return they give up, the institution gives up a significant amount of rev share on the back end, right? And so the value is around the bank. Secondly, institutions really need help in recruiting students. That's where the bank gets used, and that's actually of huge value. And then once the students are enrolled, there are supports and around that. I think a couple of things around that. One is I think increasingly institutions will figure that they can recruit the students themselves, and the larger R1 institutions will figure that they can actually fund those recruitment efforts on their own because their borrowing costs are pretty low. And I think you'll see an increase in that kind of activity. I do think that in general, institutions don't do the support function well, and they actually don't do the actual courseware creation very well either. It tends to be varied. It's not based on collecting the right data. Support services can't work properly. Things like early warnings aren't enabled by that. So I think that's an area where they could use some help, and I do think that private providers can actually get involved with institutions and improve what they're doing. I'd also say that let's be real honest about it. OPMs largely service graduate programs currently because they charge the most money. They have the least student requirements, right, around support because these are motivated people in programs like that, and so they're highly profitable. So we will see how the support functions move as they move into supporting more undergraduate programs, or even down into things like the community college level. I mean, we'll see if that actually happens. Is that profitable, and can those programs be enabled by OPM providers?
George, thoughts on the business model and suites of services?
We're not in the core of this part of the market, but as a outsider looking into it and watching and working with these schools, I mean, the thing that I'm seeing is we went from hey, this is complicated, I don't know how to do it, let's go find somebody to help us with it, to we need to understand this, we need to bring it in. And so it's going from an outsource to a more augmentation model of they're looking for more shorter contracts, more a la carte services to fill in the gaps as the schools are starting to say, we need to figure this out, we need to understand how to do this. And then once they do, they realize the areas that they don't need to do, but it's not a soup to nuts.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of an efficient way to ask this, but would we maybe all agree that in the future we would see more of a la carte unbundling of the traditional soup to nuts?
I think you're already seeing it.
Yeah.
I think we're all already doing it. And your point, Nina, is excellent.
No, not in Don's case.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think you may potentially see in the undergraduate space programs in a box, which would include things like faculty recruitment and actually white labeled courseware. I think you might actually see that in the undergraduate space.
Yep. Some examples of that already, in a sense, from non-credit. And courseware and content has come up in the discussion a lot so far, and I think each of you have a lot of experience with that. I'm trying to think of, I want to be sure we define it right, but that's a small piece of the overall spend, right, on sort of courseware and course materials, but it's a very significant one, and it's one that's gone more digital. You could argue it's been disrupted. Could you each comment on where you see the future and sort of the business success and the opportunity or the challenges when we talk about the content part of the higher ed value chain? Maybe that's a very complicated question.
I'll just say one very small slice of it. I think sometimes I'm thinking about the content trap book, and content is being commodified, and I don't think that that's really a safe place to go and say, well, we can create this curriculum and we don't have to retool it, we don't have to tweak it. The content's become so commodified that there's really no opportunity for differentiating. I actually think that's part of the problem that, in a sense, some universities got into, where you set your curriculum and you don't look at it again for 5 years, and then it takes you 5 years to make any changes. And so by then it's 10 years old, and you actually have to look at it all over again. having been through that a couple of times as a former faculty member. But that need to be able to have an agile curriculum design and content tweaking. So I think that means it's still going to be, to some extent, expensive, but as we've already seen, looking for the places where you can decrease the cost of creating your curriculum, but keeping it as flexible and agile and being able to change it with the needs of the market. If we get too comfortable with quote-unquote commodifying our content, then we're not going to be able to respond to the needs of the employment market and learners as fast as we need to be.
George?
Yeah, I think two different parts. So on the commoditization of content, I agree with you. I mean, what you're seeing as more of the content is moving to a subscription type model, either be it limited term ebooks to our full Cengage Unlimited subscription. As you're moving to those models, one of the things you're starting to see is copyright law is not driving our decision to update content. So I have to change 20% of the content if I do that. 20% of the content might not be what needs to be changed every 4 years. The right content needs to be changed. So you're seeing a big focus on let's change what's not working, not necessarily refreshing the whole book. So I think you're seeing, because of new business models, a change of how we look at content and how we keep content fresh and not change content for the sake of changing content. I think when we talk about courseware and content, I think there is the narrative, really focused content, but then the assessments and the examples and the simulations that are part of it are really driving a lot more of the interest and need into the classrooms. So, we're seeing a lot of OERs solved a big problem. One of the things that they still need is assessments, and the assessments are much harder to facilitate. A lot of what courseware did when it first came to market was drive efficiency in the classroom and lower overall institution costs. So I think that's still coming through, and now we're looking at how the definition of content is becoming much more amorphic than I think it was in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Renee, do you want to?
So I've been in publishing for a long time, over 20 years, and it's changed dramatically. I think you're right. I think content, the definition of what you think of as a traditional book or content has changed. We do have and have had for a while a classic price to value issue in publishing and in higher education content. And so the market is pushing back, and rightly so. And so that's why you have new models emerging like Cengage Unlimited, like OER, like inclusive access and discounted pricing models. And we needed to do that, candidly. We had to do that to address what were egregious prices for myriad reasons. But to George, to your point, you're right. I think it's all about the content is still valuable. The content is still important. Learners still need to develop competencies. They still need to be able to develop skills. And to, in our space where we service a lot of technology professionals, a lot of accounting students, they still need to get their CPA if they want that, or get certified in PMP. It's all about, I think, when we engage with learners, we just did a workshop yesterday in our offices in Hoboken. It's all about how are they going to get those skills? How are they going to achieve those competencies and pass the course or succeed in the course? So it's about assessments. It's about designing a learning experience around the content. And that's where we've really had to shift as an industry, is actually taking a traditional textbook, on-page print model, and what does that look like, and how does that have value to the learner when it's online in a digital courseware environment?
Don?
This is usually about a 2-hour discussion at least. Couple of things. One is the market tends to be, because of the nature of institutions and faculty choice, it tends to be slow, and change is kind of slow and lumpy and uneven. So books are still considered valuable in many ways, and content's considered valuable. I think one of the biggest changes that folks are going to have to deal with over some period of time is the migration from print to digital, and also the migration into what digital can be along the lines of things like assessment and early alerts, and there's all sorts of things you can do with there, and then increasingly, how are you going to do things like VR and AR, and how are you going to actually manage the new, and AI? How are you going to manage that in digital technologies going forward? So I think that's going to be an interesting migration for people, and I also think these are things that aren't cheap to do. I mean, these are expensive things to actually develop, and so who has deep pockets right now and who's in a position to actually invest in these kind of changes going forward, I think is going to be an interesting question. That migration is going to be exceedingly difficult, but whoever wins that migration, wherever that comes from, I think we'll probably get better student outcomes with greater efficiency than we've seen before, and actually to some degree potentially enable a digital revolution in education. But there's quite a chasm to cross to get there, and I kind of feel for the content providers and try to navigate that currently.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, we still have a bit of time left. Let's see if there's any questions from the audience. If we want to open things up a little bit on these themes or other things that this has prompted.
This question is, I think, mostly directed to George. You guys just did the unlimited subscription, which is a pretty bold move, and I was wondering if you can comment on that and how that is working out for you guys.
We're in the middle of a blackout period, so there's certain things I'll be purposely vague. It's going very well. So we're just shy of 1 million subscribers as of today. And when the product was launched, first sale happened middle of August. So very happy to see that many students come through. All the metrics that we track for it are moving in the direction we were hoping. So we're seeing students are 39% of students who use the product proactively recommend it to a colleague. So for any type of referral network, it's tremendously high. It hits a sweet spot for a student, and they're telling other students, and they're telling other faculty. It's also opened up a very different conversation for us, where typically our majority of our conversations happen at the instructor level to decide are they going to use a courseware or not. I would say a very high percentage are moving much higher in the organization to look at this. How can they bring this in to their school in a different way? So yeah, it's been good. It's great to see our numbers move in a positive directions and students' results go in a positive direction. The number of tweets we are getting now about students saying, "I just saved $800." We've calculated now we've saved students about $60 million so far, and that's still that was through the first semester. So being able to save them money and for us to be having numbers moving in the right direction it's been a nice balance.
And Don?
I just add, distribution in higher ed is fundamentally broken. So I actually laud any approaches like Cengage to actually move to subscription models. I think that's actually a positive thing.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the themes, and from a business perspective, is subscriptions, services, recurring revenue, less of a, hey, here's a product, and now go try to get a fragmented market of faculty to adopt it. Other questions from the audience? Yes, Laurie.
All of you have talked about student support, and I would like a more granular definition of that. I'm a digital learning designer, and as I've designed courses and programs for online students who are 100% online, who are all around the world, who are in shortened programs, unbundled things, I feel like most of the support you see from an OPM or a university is around, it's not quite altruistic, it's mostly around getting people through registration and enrollment and getting them to sign up for something else. And if we talk about online virtual resources for virtual students at the classroom or TA level, we always say life gets in the way for online learners. That kind of support to step in when people need help, with the day-to-day contingencies of getting through a course. I don't think you're getting that from most OPMs or most universities, and I just wonder what you see as the future for that.
Great question. Yeah. We'll start with Renee, maybe.
So we've started putting those kinds of supports in place. We're doing it actually with both our traditional brick and mortar programs and with our certifications and courseware programs. So we have a very large student partner and a campus ambassador network that we have go out and support students, introduce themselves at the beginning of a class, and then do work for registration, but also for ongoing support. We have a whole program, and it's a professional development opportunity for students. We have started building in subject matter expert assistance within some of our key platforms, including our Wiley Efficient Learning platform. So if you're studying accounting, you're studying finance, and you need on-demand support, we provide that. So we are looking more at that student success, student support from the beginning, onboarding, right? And there are lots of challenges there to through their academic career and academic kind of course experience. I think then the next thing we have to look at, or that I find most interesting in talking to university administrators, is all of the life gets in the way things. So how do we help make sure that students know where to go as a course provider, as a supporting or enabling organization for the institution when they can't get their FAFSA paperwork, or when they are really struggling because they don't know how to get the help they need? How can you help students do that? And that's one of the most interesting spaces, I think, in higher education right now.
If you want to scale digital programs, you need to design them with that in mind. I mean, you cannot have armies of people answering the phone and reaching out. You need to actually use technology and platforms, and you need to actually start designing courseware so it actually gives you the data that you need to actually intervene, so that you have early alerts that come from the technology and the system, because you built the courseware in a standardized way that's around the outcomes and actually has that stuff get spit out in a scalable way. And you can also then begin to marry some of the admin stuff that you have, and actually build models around when life gets in the way, is at risk. And you could say, if you do it properly, you could say, well, there are 3 red lights here, and they have a 67% chance of dropping in the next. We know that by the data. And start using the data to actually inform who's at risk, who's red lighted, who's orange, and who's green, and actually begin to get involved there. But that's a design issue. You need to design with that in mind, that you're building kind of a technology, data and analytics system that's going to allow you to actually scale and feedback that information, so that you're not kind of guessing at that stuff, and so that you can, for example, there's a data point that I know that if you're in a working adult program and you miss a start, the percentage likelihood that you will never come back goes up significantly. And there's actually numbers around that. Some people know exactly what that number is. And so you intervene when someone's going to drop and say, you're probably not going to come back if you drop. And you say, we need to figure out a way to actually keep you involved. That's the kind of data that's really powerful in terms of influencing when life gets in the way and identifying when it happens early.
And I think we need to cross the swim lanes. I think of all students as digital students, because most traditional students are integrated with technology in some way, with homework and other things. And what we'd love to see more of is, we'll see a trend in a student, but I don't know, we don't have a connection point to the student affairs group, to all the support services that are built up in these schools, that we're not jumping over and helping them. We're seeing most of the current triggers and alerts to be in the same swim lane, that an OPM is looking for dropouts because that's part of their business model, not part of the bigger ecosystem that we're trying to get through.
Yeah, and Renee, you wanted to...
I just want to say, I agree. So it's a mixture of technology and people. So when you get the alerts, so you can nudge them, right? When you look at what students say, is if a professor or a TA can nudge the student, they get the data they need to determine that this student is at risk, then you can insert a human component. So it is. And there are wonderful tools like Inscribe and AdmitHub that are really trying to help solve that scale issue. So I think it's a balance of the two, and that's what we need to be focused on in terms of helping to catch the students before they fall. Really.
And Nina, as you scale up and develop new services for your partners, any thoughts?
A lot of what's already been said, but I thought I would just add one particular anecdote to address your question about how you maybe address TA capacity. One of our partners, Georgia Tech, one of the professors, David Joyner, he has developed essentially a answering chatbot system where, for a lot of students' questions, they found that the questions were incredibly common, and that they could create almost like a help desk, system. They could create a lot of answers that would satisfy a majority of the students at that level. So then the questions that did float up to the human, right, were far more required that human interaction. They weren't answerable in such simple sort of knowledge-based ways. And I really like that approach because, again, having, again, been a faculty member and being inundated by emails where it was the same question that was essentially, the answer was, it's in the syllabus. It's nice to think about freeing up those who are dedicated to teaching to be able to do the teaching and not do the administrative pieces. And so I think we should see more of that. I think that's a great approach to increasing the capacity of educators.
Some machine learning and chatbots. I'd have to imagine that Georgia Tech is a little bit unique in terms of some of their computing expertise and scale and ambition, but that would probably best be built by, say, an edX who has a central platform that could then serve universities with similar programs versus a university trying to build and train that kind of system on their own. Or maybe a company, right? A startup. My sense is a lot of this ecosystem in terms of where some of the investment has been.
Or a lot of our
areas.
open edX partners who would develop for our
Yes.
open source platform.
Yep, mentoring and coaching, and there's career services, analytics, all sorts of zones. I think we have 5 or 10 minutes. Other audience questions? Any other audience questions? We have one here, and then we'll go over there.
I just want to continue on the chatbot and the machine learning aspect of support. And this question is for George. In the content itself, have you built or thinking of building the system whereby you can monitor the student while they are in the content and intelligently chatbot or voice recognition, some way to reach out to students when they're actually doing something and having issues or trouble? You have kind of system built in.
So intelligent, I'll just repeat it for everyone in the video. Intelligent technology within the content platform is.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of conversations around this. There's some good startups that have kicked off this area, and we're talking about integrations. Getting one of the barriers where they're struggling right now is whose budget pays for this, and so where is it? Is this a problem of the academic side of the institution? Is it student services? Is it the content? Is it part of the platform that you're asking the student to pay for? And so that is the complexity of rolling this out: is where does it go? Who pays for this? Where's the value coming through? There's a big program that IBM did around creating a chatbot for students, and it had great results. Unfortunately, when they finished, no one could agree with which department to charge the big bill. And so IBM put that project to the side because they couldn't find the business model to put it around. So I think we're still incubating on these types of things and understand how does it fit in and where is the best place where it can be fostered and grown in that area.
And we had a question over here as well, I believe.
I had the microphone, so I'm sorry.
Oh, and there's a mic. Okay, yep.
Right here. So going back to the previous topic of student support, I think we glossed over the instructor and the instructor support, especially because we're throwing all these tools at them, and how do they use them? So part of it is also the human touch. How do I use the green, red, yellow? Where do I find it in my LMS? How do I send that back to student? That whole part. In addition, I'm an adjunct. I have other parts of my life that I have to pay attention to.
So this argues for some standardization around the curriculum, so that and appropriate training for adjuncts, so that it's as simple as possible for you to pick up and teach the program. And so one of the things about higher ed is higher ed has an advantage of biodiversity. Biodiversity is very difficult to actually execute when you're trying to do, for example, online programs at scale with lots of adjunct faculty. Makes it super hard for adjuncts to actually understand and get up to speed and do the right thing. So I think there's some recognition, but I think it's slow, that there needs to be an easier, more standardized approach for both adjunct faculty and for students who are working adults who need a simple path, right? And they don't need to learn navigation of every single course because it's been done differently. That's not really student friendly. And I think there's a move afoot to actually do that, so that when we talk about you as a faculty, you get the right training, you have something that's very straightforward, and you understand across the whole curriculum you're teaching, or what of course is what the red and the yellows, and also maybe you're not responsible for actually addressing those. Maybe somebody else is responsible for addressing those because you have a busy life.
Great. Other questions? Yes, we have one over there.
Hi. Hopefully I can phrase this the right way. There's about 7,000 Title IV higher ed institutions in the United States. And of course, many of them are looking at the changing demographics and what they're going to do. And I think, Don, I'm kind of directing this towards you in your online capacity. As they all start looking at online learning and how they extend it, my question is how do they differentiate themselves and avoid the kind of consolidation we see in digital deliveries and online deliveries? elsewhere in other things. For example, Amazon is an everything store. They kind of dominate online. What's going to differentiate UMass online from any other online institution as people move away from regional affiliations to their colleges and schools to I can take the courses anywhere?
Interesting question.
Well, there's an assumption that people are going to move away from regional affiliations and brands there, which I might challenge as first off. I do think there will probably, first of all 7,000 will not survive, and all 7,000 will not be in online, and well, the brands won't sustain that. I think that's pretty clear. I think there are major brands that will survive, and the ones that actually figure out online properly actually will probably establish themselves as, at worst, super regionals. You begin to see them formulate right now in terms of super regional online players. And I think that'll be sorted out in the next 24, 36 months, frankly. And beyond that, I think you're talking about other online programs. I wouldn't call them just niche players, but I would call they're going to need to actually have specialties and have some specialty around the brand identification. And again, they'll scale to a certain size. I mean, if you have a good brand, you'll scale to a certain size. But I think the folks are going to be big scale providers. I mean, take University of Maryland, University College, already there, already Mid-Atlantic, big supplier. They're going to be a super regional, right? And there are others that are forming. So I think the quick answer is this market is going to have consolidation. Brands are important. If you have a brand, and if you've done the brand work and you're a big state institution and your brand comes across as being very favorably disposed, I think you're in good position to actually capitalize if you can get your head around how to do it properly.
Any other thoughts on this topic from anyone else? Well, we have just a couple more minutes. Maybe in closing, we'll just go down the line. I would ask, we've touched on a lot. It's a big theme here, higher ed megatrends. So we've touched on a lot of different sub-themes. Whether you are at a university, a faculty member, a startup employee or CEO or an investor, if you could just think about all those diverse types of audience member, what would you be watching? Maybe a minute each or 30 seconds, from these higher ed megatrends and these changes, what are the things that you would monitor and see as either the opportunities or the challenges that we have ahead?
Picking just one.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but I'm really interested to see what happens with credentialing, right? I mean, this is your cup of tea, just what happens with micro-credentials. Sean published a great paper a little bit ago looking at how HR and employers are taking up micro-credentials and what they're thinking about new kinds of credentials. Great information in there. The trend looks good, but I think for me in particular and for edX, that's something we're really interested in.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
I think I could pick a lot, but accreditation and how accreditation runs through this system, and as the modalities are changing, and how you bring in the financial aid and other support systems into the process in a much broader manner.
Yeah, a lot of change happening in quality assurance and accreditation regulation. Dom?
Yeah, I'm going to choose two just because I can. One would be I'd look at legislation and regulation. I'd watch that pretty closely.
So two, yeah.
That's one. And then the second one I'd look at is I'd watch employers pretty carefully to see what they're doing, because I think they're going to be a major influencer on education.
Great. And Renee?
I was going to say, I think the link to corporate and the partnerships with corporate and needing to actually have institutions and corporations working very closely together to determine what the job market is going to dictate and what skills students are going to come out of. And to Don's point, having some aligned curriculum. I mean, we did a competency mapping for data analytics with BHEF for the last 18 months or so. I mean, there's no standards, right? Mm-hmm. So everyone agrees that students need to be more proficient in data and analytics, but what does that actually mean when you have to deliver that into an institution? When you have to, as an instructor, decide where you're going to put that into your curriculum and what you have to take out. But we know that corporations are saying that's one of the key competencies that students don't have, right? So are they going to just take a credential, take a little module? We developed one, but great. But are they going to take a module and do that themselves? Is the university going to put that into their curriculum? So I think it's really about connecting and understanding what As Ryan said, what is the value we're providing to graduates, and how can we help them, succeed professionally? And what is that going to do to the curriculum?
Yeah, a lot of work to be done there, a lot of opportunity too.
Yep.
Great. Well, we're going to end right on time. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a good discussion.